Afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We'll give it just another minute and we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Josh, are you there?
Hello. Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, good. How are you?
Great. Great to have everyone join us. I'm Guillermo Gomez, Program Director at the Urban Design Forum.
I'm Joshua McWhorter. I'm the Managing Editor of Urban Omnibus, the digital publication of the Architectural League of New York.
It's really nice to be here with you, Josh, and our members and friends. I'm most excited that the forum is co-hosting this event with you all at the League and Omnibus, kind of a preview of some future collaborations to come. In case you're new to the forum, we're an independent membership organization that mobilizes civic leaders to confront defining issues in the built environment. We empower professionals of diverse backgrounds, industries, and perspectives to shape a better future for all New Yorkers. We investigate complex challenges in the built environment, study alternative approaches from cities around the world, and advance progressive strategies to build a more democratic city. A big thanks to the continued support of our fellows, our board of directors, and our directors circle.
And in case you're new to the Architectural League of New York, we're an organization that nurtures excellence in architecture, design, and urbanism, and seeks to stimulate thinking, debate, and action on the critical design and building issues of our time through live events, digital media, publications, installations, and exhibitions. And Urban Omnibus is the League's digital publication, as I mentioned, dedicated to raising new questions, illuminating diverse perspectives, and documenting creative projects to advance the collective work of city making. And on behalf of the League and Omnibus, I'd like to extend a big thanks to Urban Design Forum for this wonderful collaboration, and to all of our participants for joining us today. Our programs are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, and by the New York State Council on the Arts, with support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature. We'd also like to thank the Architectural League's members whose support makes all of our programming possible. To learn more about membership, you can visit archleague.org. So this August, Princeton University Press, in association with Places Journal, published A City is Not a Computer by Shannon Mattern, who's a professor of anthropology at the New School, and I should say a good friend and collaborator, both to Urban Omnibus and the Architectural League, and myself personally. The book is in part a culmination of Shannon's years of illuminating scholarship on the so-called smart city, that now ubiquitous catch-all term evoking everything from your neighborhood Link NYC kiosks to nefarious urban surveillance networks, anything from tiny sensors to big data. Now, the slipperiness of the phrase itself, the fungibility, if you will, has been useful for both those embracing visions of the city as a seamless, digitally mediated experience, and also to those who resist this notion of urban life. Shannon's work has engaged productively with the ways in which quote unquote smartness itself has become a kind of screen, a mediating device through which we increasingly perceive the people and processes that make the city. Yet her work also uses the frame of urban intelligence as a springboard for thinking through the social, cultural, and political knowledges that have been accumulating in cities long before the advent of digital technologies, surpassing even the most sophisticated algorithms in their depth and complexity. Networks in this city are neither neutral nor neural, but rather the embedded knowledges of people in navigating grounded space through historical time maintained by communities and institutions.
Thanks, Josh, for that beautiful framing of today's discussion. So today we'll be hearing kind of from a range of practitioners at the intersection of architecture, design, data, and creative technology, whose work engages with urban intelligence, not for the sake of innovation itself, but to better understand, support, and center public knowledge. So here's how today's program is going to be structured. First, we've asked Shannon to share introductory remarks to frame our discussion, pulling a range of topics from her most recent book, A City Is Not a Computer. Following her presentation, we're really excited to include responses from 4 incredible practitioners. As co-hosts, the Forum and the League and Omnibus, we're going to act as kind of facilitators in the discussion, bridging thoughts, practices in a fun roundtable conversation. So throughout today's event, feel free to plug yourself into the chat, who you are, where you're beaming in from. We can't see you, but we of course want to hear from you. Mercury is in retrograde, so we'll do our best to make your voices and questions heard and work around the Zoom world. So let's get started. I'd love to invite Shannon to join us on screen. Hi, Shannon. So glad you can join us.
Hi, thanks, Guillermo and Josh. Thanks so much to both of you for all the work you've done behind the scenes to make this happen. It's really an honor, especially considering that we've been friends and colleagues for such a long time. And also, I'm really grateful to all the folks on the panel who, again, many of whom are friends, longtime colleagues, and whose work I greatly admire. I am joining you today from the unceded territory of the Lenape people. Really grateful to all of you for being here, not only the panelists, but also those of you who are joining as interlocutors with us today. I'm going to share my screen and share a few slides to begin.
Terrific. I'll pass it on to you, but let me just give you a quick introduction. I'm always surprised at how your practice really cuts through disciplinary boundaries, especially when friends and colleagues from different fields are always familiar with your name and work. So just a quick intro, and then I'll pass the mic, a much deserved intro. So Shannon, if you're not familiar with Shannon Mattern, she's a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the New School in New York. For nearly 15 years, she served as a faculty member at the New School's School of Media Studies. She's written and taught about archives, libraries, and other media spaces, media infrastructure, spatial epistemologies, and mediated sensation and exhibition. She is the author of 3 books: The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities, Deep Mapping the Media City, Code and Clay, Dirt and Data, 5,000 Years of Urban Media, all published with the University of Minnesota Press. And then most recently, as Josh mentioned, A City Is Not a Computer, published by the Princeton University Press with Places Journal. She's written nearly 100 journal articles and book chapters, including a regular long-form column about urban data and mediated infrastructures for Places. And she, of course, contributes to public design and interactive projects and exhibitions too. So just had to plug in that introduction. I'll pass the mic and podium to you, Shannon.
Sorry for scooping you there, Guillermo.
No worries.
Okay. All right. So now I'll share my screen. Okay, so here we are today. Again, thanks to all of you for joining us and to our hosts for having us. I'm going to start by setting up a little bit contemporary and local context, especially for those of you who are joining us from New York. As you're undoubtedly aware, Eric Adams, the imminent mayor of New York City and a former police captain, advances strengthened policing as the answer to many of the city's ills, particularly its supposed recent spike in crime. A vocal critic of discriminatory policing while he was in uniform, Adams helped shape CompStat, an operational management program based on real-time data collection and analysis, which inform what's called predictive policing, a system that has indeed been correlated with lower crime rates, but that has also incentivized controversial stop and frisk practices and has been known to unfairly target people of color. This algorithmically oriented managerial approach would inform other dimensions of Adams' administration. As he has said, he essentially wants to build a CompStat for most city departments, generating a CompStat for the city writ large. We see similar algorithmic aspirations elsewhere. China's Zhonggan, Saudi Arabia's Neom, Diapers.com's Tolosa, Senegal's Akon City, and Pronama's Capital's mission, which you see in the top center there. Quote, using the lessons of Silicon Valley for urban development, where the city is the product, end quote. These are, of course, not new visions, as Jennifer Light, a fabulous historian from MIT, powerfully argues in several of her books, including this particular one I'm showing you here, From Warfare to Welfare. Cities have long partnered with tech and consulting firms like RAND, as she describes in her book, to develop computational models of urban planning and governance. And as I described in my 2017 book, cities have long been intelligent, wired, coded, responsive environments, and I'm putting all those in scare quotes. There is indeed much to be gained by envisioning cities as information processing and storage machines, as micro-scale manifestations of communications networks, considering communications as an integral and essential infrastructure in urban life. And urban data do and can, as we'll hear from several of our panelists, contribute to more efficient, functional, inclusive, and just cities. But in A City is Not a Computer, I examine what's lost when we conceive of our cities primarily or solely as computational environments, and when we regard data as the holy grail of urban intelligence, as has happened in some recent developments, particularly those driven by corporations, by tech corporations. What might be learned by looking to other urban institutions and practices as exemplars of different ways of knowing that embody different values beyond intelligence, convenience, and efficiency, all of which are great, but none of which are kind of sufficient for the diversity of people and communities in a city. So the book began, as Josh mentioned, as a series of articles for Places Journal, with whom I've worked for close to a decade now. I have to say it's been the most, in addition to working with Urban Omnibus, which has been fantastic, Places has also been a really fruitful experience, just excellent editing. We get to work with an art director. It's just been among the most rewarding publishing experiences of my career. And then I was invited, because Places has a partnership with Princeton, to turn some of these articles into a book. Most of the pieces I've written for Urban Omnibus, actually not most, I'd say maybe half, have been about very kind of timely things, about new tech developments, kind of new urban projects. And turning this into a book, I thought gave me a chance to transform a lot of this discussion of fast-paced tech developments, many of which kind of age quickly, to something that's actually addressing more enduring problems or enduring questions and problems. Also, I have to say, writing the book was also in part a response to people who regard, and wrongly, I think, and I'm sure the folks at Urban Omnibus will agree, that digital publications are somehow not as serious or rigorous as print-based publications, but that's not at all the case. We see kind of fantastic and expert editing at both publications like Urban Omnibus and Places Journal. Also, venues like these, and then again, the book audience, the kind of results from those allow you to reach more interdisciplinary audiences, and also comes with obligations that come with broad and immediate reach that can be associated with more digital public scholarship. I also wanted to take some of these articles and put them in dialogue with each other, and particularly for my more timely topical articles, to demonstrate, as I said, that there's an enduring resonance for these seemingly ephemeral issues, and many especially responding to the willfully ahistorical nature of the move fast and break things mentality of tech, acknowledging that they have deep histories and deep and profound repercussions. So the book allowed me to remix, update, and in some cases, substantially rewrite source articles, and to supplement this work with quite a bit of brand new material. I could, in the book, combine discourses and audiences that are often separate. So the book could potentially reach smart city people, tech folks, industry practitioners, critics and critical technologists, urban planners and architects, librarians and archivists, theorists and activists, and policymakers who care about things like maintenance and care. Those are all threads or themes that the book addresses, as well as artists who are invested in all of these issues. Sorry, I think I'm a couple slides behind. These are the artists, some of the artists that I've included in the book. So the book would also enable me to reach new readers, particularly through its small format and affordable pricing. We made sure it was under $20, making it especially eager to make it accessible for teaching. And also this small format made it available for reading while exploring the city, as several people have written, and I'm very pleased to tell me that they have done. So I'm going to briefly outline the chapters for you. So I start with an object lesson, a physical thing, a case study that really crystallizes a lot of the ideologies and epistemologies or ways of knowing that come with data-driven urbanism, namely the dashboard, the control center that runs a lot of data-driven urban operations. Then in the second chapter, I demonstrate the limitations of reducing urban intelligence to computational models and look at kind of other ways of acknowledging other knowledge institutions, other ways of knowing that are embedded historically and today in cities. And then in the next chapter, I demonstrate the limitations of smartness again by offering concrete examples of alternative ways of knowing, specifically libraries and other public knowledge institutions, which are described in the public knowledge chapter, and then looking at the intelligence and knowledge, wisdom embedded in practices and sensibilities of maintenance and care and repair, which is addressed in the maintenance codes chapter. And all throughout, as I mentioned, there are lots of examples of art and design, which reflect yet another means of manifesting knowledge. I also added a new introduction and conclusion, drawing on and taking literally Christopher Alexander's A City is Not a Tree. So the book is called A City is Not a Computer. Wanted to draw a parallel to a similarly titled piece, canonical piece, thinking through other species and how those other species might resist or respond to the imposition of smart management. I also look at how they might model for us other, more capacious, sustainable ways of thinking about urban intelligence. This also spun off the introduction and conclusion, all the arboreal thinking I was doing there spun off into a chapter that I just published in Places a couple of weeks ago about tree thinking. So writing these bookend chapters, as I said, also prompted me to acknowledge how tree models have informed human intelligence and computational intelligence in particular for centuries, if not millennia. And this is the piece that I published on arboreal thinking just a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to stop sharing and talk about how we're going to further expand and spin out from these multiple modes of intelligence through our panelists for today. So grafting is a central theme in the book. The grafting of new urban forms onto existing rootstock, the fact that grafting is both a mixture of cultivation and engineering, as we might prefer to think of design and urban planning, the fact that grafting is both an art and a science, again, which are kind of mixed sensibilities that would appeal to a lot of folks who are planners and designers. Also thinking about the grafting of various past projects onto new ones to cultivate a book, the grafting of disparate disciplinary knowledges and creative practices to provide a more prismatic view of the subject matter of what a city is and can be. This grafted intelligence model that gives intellectual and formal structure to the book also characterizes the group we've brought together here today. I'm really thrilled that these folks all agreed to join us. I invited them collectively with Josh and Guillermo and Anne and the folks at both of the Architectural League and the Urban Design Forum because they collectively represent the multiple intelligences and values that I highlight in the book. Capacious and prismatic, as my students know, are among my favorite adjectives, and I think that in aggregate, this group we have here today embodies those qualities. So I'll say a few words about each, and you can find their full bios, I imagine, on the website. From Farzana, we'll hear about the prismatic intelligences embedded and embodied in our urban communities and how we can use digital tools to facilitate community engagement, to ensure that all that knowledge informs the architectural design and urban planning and administration. How can we graft more grassroots models onto big data? How can we graft together qualitative methods and statistics? This is what we'll hear from Farzana. From Dan, then, we'll hear more about how communities can build physical and social architectures that draw upon and steward their indigenous or kind of rooted in knowledges. How do we cultivate cooperative intelligence? And how do we maintain such infrastructures? And what metaphors, as I describe in the book, a whole bunch of them, might help us to think about this work. In the book, I talk about cities as computers, as trees, as machines, as biophysical bodies. But what about the city as a kitchen or the computer itself as a city? These are some of the things Dan will help us think through. Karen will then share her work on various spaces of public knowledge, including the Greenpoint Library and Environmental Education Center and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, both of which I discuss in the book, as well as the broader role of data in designing and programming public libraries and building equitable social infrastructures. The Greenpoint Library beautifully grafts together multiple forms of community knowledge, local environmental data, print collections, oral histories, embodied knowledge, practice knowledge, lab activities, and the architecture and landscape themselves as material archives and pedagogical tools. So these are the things that Karen will help us think through. Shawn will then graft together some themes from several of our fellow interlocutors in discussing how community data can be used as tools for advocacy and resistance. I'm eager to hear more about what constitutes community data. How capaciously are we defining data? What kinds of intelligence can it or can't it represent? And how can we help communities generate and steward relevant data to serve their purposes, whatever those purposes might be? Given that much of my research draws from and informs my own teaching, and the fact that everyone here on this panel today is a gifted educator, and I've had the pleasure of seeing some of these folks in action, I'm hoping our conversation will also address pedagogy, both in the classroom and out in public among heterogeneous intergenerational communities, a form of public pedagogy. Schools and salons and ateliers and campuses and informal learning spaces are, like libraries, critical infrastructures for cultivating and circulating urban intelligence. I'm so grateful to all of you, panelists and audience, for agreeing to participate in the discussion today, and to the Urban Design Forum and the Architectural League for hosting. Special thanks to Guillermo and Josh and Anne. And to the folks who've logged in today, we look forward to drawing on the prismatic knowledge you all bring to the room through the Q&A and our discussion afterwards. So please do share your questions and comments, your insights and experiences. And with that, I'll turn things over to Farzana.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. So a big thank you to Urban Design Forum and the Architectural League of New York for the invitation to participate among such an esteemed panel of speakers, and special thanks to Shannon for sharing with us her insightful book. Although my work spans several scales from urban design to building to placemaker to product, what is consistent is a level of outreach that commits to learning from and working with citizens of the city, the primary actors in the stage sets that we shape as the built environment. This often takes the form of lively and passionate community meetings in schools, churches, public gardens, workshops inviting citizens to share concerns, document personal narratives and messy observations, smells, sights, and noises through interactive maps and activities, and to vote on ideas with ballots, and even pull out some Sharpies to co-create with us. What has traditionally resulted from such engagement are reports such as these recent ones for East 125th Street in Harlem, and for the NYCHA Dyckman Houses complex in Inwood, with vision plans, policy recommendations, advocacy campaigns, and resilient urban design strategies. In any engagement, treating citizens as the experts in the room and working with the community through all phases before, during, and after are critical for success. But the pandemic challenged us to rethink our engagement strategies, leaving us to somehow cultivate trust and comfortable conversation in the virtual spaces of Zoom and social media. In the Neighborhoods Now project in Bed-Stuy, we found that we were actually able to reach even more diverse and wide audiences with such media, and also create living archives of the conversation with videos posted and reposted by the stakeholders. Building on this, we've recently been developing a new tool where 3 user audiences work hand in hand: citizens, professionals, and government agencies. Citizens respond to professional agency requests for qualitative and observational data input to fill data gaps, and also challenge and or validate quantitative big data assumptions. The citizen science data is democratic and accessible. It is known where the data is coming from, and ideally, any faulty data can be challenged and flagged by the citizens themselves, developing a self-sustaining data check and level of transparency. The data empowers the community with knowledge and the opportunity to connect with project collaborators, citizen collectives, sharing similar concerns, resource suppliers, insurance agencies, investors, to both create bottom-up community-driven initiatives while also responding to requests to actively co-create and offer feedback in professional-led projects. In an effort to minimize politically biased and capitalist biased agendas and sanitized data sets, the dashboard, quote unquote, that results is bottom-up, while also multidisciplinary and systemic, highlighting cascading failures in times of crisis as marked by citizen input and overlaid with known infrastructural supply and distribution chains. And what we'll hear more from Karen, perhaps, is the library as a space for public knowledge. But what happens in rural communities where outdated technologies prevail and places for education are often either not socially accessible by groups such as young girls after a certain age, or not physically accessible due to distance by rural populations? So in the design of a new school in Senegal, we integrated a unique door and window system where all workshop and education materials are housed in a dual-sided facade. The modular window frames slide out and are received by a door that can be laid horizontally, ready to be hooked onto a vehicle and driven out for more remote outreach as a pop-up unit. This essentially centers the facade as the primary space for public knowledge rather than the building itself. And to promote democratic access, it is equally interactive from both inside the school and outside on the street. Finally, these are a series of modular infrastructure stations that we've deployed at different scales across Puerto Rico to meet challenges faced by vulnerable communities due to climate risk and social disinvestment. We have 5 off-the-grid station types: drinking water, energy, hand washing, urinal, and medical, all equipped with communications and tech infrastructure to create a network linking the stations for emergency alerts, local weather data collection, maintenance data, and community activity archive. In times of storm or failed infrastructure, these spaces become recognized go-to landmarks to reliably meet basic needs and act as a space for public forum. Cell phones can be charged, drinking water is accessible, the stations become relief aid drop-off points and can offer medical first aid. The stations are built together with the local community who learn how to construct and install the project, while also committing to its long-term maintenance, security, and public access. This, in fact, is the first level of knowledge creation. Generally, a one-size-fits-all solution doesn't work. However, prototyping modules with modifications to meet local challenges are successful as a kit of parts. These stations are flexible and multi-purpose, acting alone or scaled up in concert with multiple modules and types. And to ensure robust use and programming, we are working beyond traditional project delivery to also develop storm station-related K-12 STEM curricula, sustainable vocational training, activist, artist, and theater programs, and medical testing and vaccination hubs. When you build community stewardship in the field and empower local residents to face challenges themselves, the possibilities are really endless. Thank you. So with that, I believe the next speaker we have is Dan. So Dan, if you'd take it away, please.
Sure, thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to hope that you can all see my screen. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Dan. Thank you to the Urban Design Forum and the Architectural Design League for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. Yeah, I'm going to share a little bit of some ideas. There's some things I've been gnawing on. I'm not sure exactly if they'll come out, but I'm really excited because and honored to be invited here, especially to respond to Shannon's book, A City is Not a Computer, which is definitely kind of activating and thinking about some thoughts. So I try to keep this a little quick. They're roughly around like what are our actuators and the city as kitchen. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk more about this in the comments and the discussions. So before I start, just as a prompt, please remember a meaningful time when you rearranged a space you collectively live or work in. When was it? And does it happen as often as you would want it to? How much agency do we have to change the spaces we work in and live in? So my name is Dan Taeyoung. I'm not going to talk too much about myself. You've already seen my bio, but essentially, I'm interested in the way we think and collaborate and learn with each other through collectively created communities and experimental tools and environments. But I'll mostly be talking about the collective created communities, mostly because my practice as someone who is a spatial practitioner involves creating collectives or cooperatives and living in them, And so my engagement with practices has been on a 7-year and a 5-year time scale. I really appreciate being part of communities and learning and knowing the space. So I don't think of myself often as a designer, but rather a grower and maintainer grower, maintainer of spaces, a grafter of spaces, co-creator, co-grower, so to speak. Right now I'm part of Soft Surplus, which is collectively full of many friends and people, initially co-founded by Austin Wade Smith, Melanie Hoff, and myself. It's an artist-run studio space. We're transitioning into a worker-owned cooperative as we speak. We steward the space together, run the space. And the photograph you see is the result of a kind of very kitchenic, I would call it, a kitchen-like transformation of how the space has grown up over the years. But I'll try to get into that a little bit more. So what I want to share is a little bit thinking about a city and data and public knowledge from the perspective of having lived in and grown spaces from the inside. So one thought I've been having is reading Shannon, your book, is like, what is the other side of data? What are our actuators, so to speak? If we're thinking about data and local knowledges and maintenance, as you've so wonderfully laid out, one thing I've been thinking about is, well, data exists in operation to sensors, right? There are various different sensing devices, cameras, you write about this, like the, remote sensing, many different sensors that we understand exist in the city to like map and understand flows, traffic flows, movement flows, vehicular flows. In kind of machinic terms, the opposite with sensor is an actuator, like a motor or an actual linear actuator that moves things. So if kind of play on this kind of data, if data comes from sensors, what is the actuator? What are we doing with our data is maybe the question that I've been thinking about, that I've been like gnawing on a little bit, which I'm sure many others will have answers to. And so one of the things, I hate to do this, I've never done this, but I'm going to invoke two old French white guys thinking about Anti-Oedipus, which I just recently reread. And at the very start of this book, they talk about design machines, which I reread this and actually finally kind of really had a good grasp on this, which is essentially this notion to celebrate, think about desire through the metaphor of machines, and machines not in this deterministic, cold way, but machines in that machines produce things. They produce objects, they're made of things. The pasta machine we see is made out of a machine, but the pasta machine itself is a machine which will make pasta, which will then make something else. And so the idea of the machinic metaphor is joyous, at least when I read it recently, because there's never any start or end. There's always just this kind of celebratory objects creating objects, desire flowing in a certain way, which I think is actually underlying some of the tone in your book, Shannon, because there's kind of a general celebration of maintenance, of alteration, of openness, of kind of user-driven cities rather than this kind of top-down design. And so one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of kind of this, okay, if a machine is an interesting metaphor, what is a domain where machines are celebrated? And I think that's one of them is like the wood shop. And then another of them is the kitchen, where I look at all these machinic tools, so to speak, to do things, operate, grab, form, transform. At a commercial scale, there's definitely a lot of commercial machines used in the kitchen. So all these machines move together. If one of the things I've been thinking about is if the city is a machine, there's also the city as kitchen. And so what I've been maybe kind of thinking is, what is the role of, if my practice has involved living and like working with friends in the shared spaces to operate and change them, and to kind of like cooperate, create meetings, create containers to do so. In many ways, I think what I'm really curious about and interested in is to see the city as a kitchen that is more produced by its inhabitants, and that our relationship with data and knowledge is less of a sensorial one and more of an actuator one. I wonder in some ways whether maybe a polemic or a question I want to bring is like, if the city is a kitchen, one last comment. If we thought of food as only coming from restaurants, right, then we would almost imagine almost all of our consumption to be restaurant oriented, but food can also come from kitchens, and that I think kitchens and restaurants are a very ideal metaphor for what kind of learning spaces or what kind of action we want to see in the world. A question that I have in terms of maybe thinking about the city and data is, we have all these sensors, we have these networks. I work with technology and data, and after, the comprehension and the studies of data happens, like what's on the flip side? What are the kind of actuations we see? How do actuations happen at the level of the community space and the spaces we hold that we can actually shape together collectively, rather than perhaps at a policy level? Another question is the designer maintenance divide emerge because we have this idea of data versus actuation, and instead, what are the day-to-day practices that maybe everyone here should hold in terms of shaping the spaces we want, as opposed to kind of like designing the spaces so that the users might use it. So those are some of the loose questions I'm hoping to gel in. Ultimately, as I kind of finish these comments, maybe the thought is, the kitchen is a really optimistic space, at least for me, where like there's experimentation, there's formality, there's performance, but there's also improvisation, there's care, there's very casual notions. And I feel like that's maybe an interesting metaphor that I'm hoping to explore a little bit together in the conversation. And the last point is that I'm not sure how data fits into the kitchen. What's a data-driven kitchen? And maybe that's kind of the point. What is a data-driven city? So thank you for listening. And I'm really excited to talk together. I think next is Karen. So I'll pass the metaphorical mic to you and talk soon.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you all for inviting me to join this conversation. I'll share my slides also. And hopefully you all are seeing that now. Shannon's book is really a rich gift of observations about city and data and growth and knowledge and so much more. I am probably not surprisingly especially excited about the chapter titled Public Knowledge, and will present some of the public knowledge places, the libraries and the archives we've been working on that respond a little bit to that chapter and some of the broader themes of the book, and hopefully connect back to some of the other panelists' work. Shannon speaks of libraries functioning as both knowledge infrastructure and social infrastructure. And I want to start with our project Re-envisioning Branch Libraries as one network system from 2014, because it looks specifically at libraries as essential infrastructure in the city, and how using data-driven mapping tools and new zoning tools could lead to more informed decision-making to align libraries with other pressing needs, including in this case, affordable housing and resiliency. Our interdisciplinary team included my firm and my colleague at GSEP in the planning department, Leah Meisterlin, and James Lima, Planning and Development. And many of you know this project was organized by the Architectural League and the Center for Urban Future. And Shannon's work on libraries really grounded all of our team's research and provided a lot of context to kick off this project. So our team proposed a multi-scalar approach to looking at libraries as social infrastructure. At the scale of the city, we mapped data from diverse sources. I think we had about 50 data sets with library branch data, population data, zoning data, locations of other social services, environmental, housing, and data about communities and people. And we use this to learn more about branches. We also used it to look for future library locations and to see where library needs would align with affordable housing and needs for planning for resiliency. And we applied that research to a site at Brighton Beach Library. It became a kind of demonstration site for this work, where we integrated a design proposal for a larger branch for resiliency planning and for affordable housing. And we used that data to identify the kind of unique needs of the Brighton Beach community members in the context of the network of other social infrastructure that was nearby. In the course of this work, we also saw that if we looked at libraries in relationship to information that informs resilience planning, our mapping determined that of the 207 branch libraries across all 3 library systems in the city, 149 of them were either in flood evacuation zones or within a half a mile of one. So rather than seeing the needs of libraries and the need for resilience planning as competing priorities in the city, aligning those priorities could rebalance this networked system. This project was completed just prior to starting the work on re-envisioning branch libraries and was our introduction to public library work. Designed for the Queens Library System, Glen Oaks Branch Library serves one of the most ethnically diverse communities in Queens, with a population of approximately 30,000 people from 50 countries, speaking 30 different languages. The identity of this building is connected to the word search, which is an ephemeral projection of sunlight onto the facade. It's not always there. The movement of the word connects the unchanging physicality of this site to the changing daily and seasonal conditions. If it's summer, the word is longer. If it's winter, the word is shorter. It varies in scale and legibility as a result of time of day, the amount of sunlight, in the season. If a cloud passes, the word disappears. The word search displays the ever-changing and dynamic environmental conditions, and it's conceptually linked through one of its definitions to a global network of information. We were really interested in the many forms of the word search, from a physical action to a virtual activity, and how that links to libraries as both places and portals, physical and virtual. At the street level, we've developed an abstract pattern on the storefront glass that's meant to resemble books on a shelf from a distance. And the pattern doubles as part of a shading strategy as well on the western side. But in close proximity, you also see that the pattern is information about the languages that are spoken in Glen Oaks. The word search is translated into all 30 languages spoken here. Over 50% of Queens residents have a language other than English as their primary language at home. We hoped that every family in this community would find the word search in their primary language and be encouraged to enter. Also, while working on this project, we were surprised to learn that a language dies every 2 weeks in the world, and that the projections are by 2100, half of the 7,000 languages spoken in the world will be extinct. That's probably not the case for the languages spoken here, but with this in mind, we see the building itself as a kind of archive of the community at a specific point in time. The Schomburg is a research library within the New York Public Library System. It's a campus of buildings between 135th and 136 along Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem. One of the buildings is a 1905 Carnegie Library by McKim, Mead and White. And the large brick building along Malcolm X was designed by Max Bond, completed in 1980. There's also a local branch, County Cullen, around the corner on 136th Street. And the Schomburg collection contains over 10 million artifacts with extensive film and digital video recordings, art, artifacts, manuscripts, archives. It's considered the most significant collection in the world of materials of history and culture of people of African descent. And as a research library, it's both critical that the materials stay on site, but also as a research library and not a branch library, the majority of people who access this are scholars rather than the local community. Khalil Muhammad, the second of the 3 directors we worked with over the course of this project, wanted the community and the people walking by to know about the materials inside. He was particularly interested in reaching teens and young adults and believed that using digital media would be a good way to connect to that group in particular. So we developed strategies for thinking about how to turn the building inside out, in using the addition we did and displays on the exterior to draw the community in, to reveal the collections. And we also developed in this project reading rooms, research spaces, and archives for the different divisions of the Schomburg, responding to the specific needs of working with very different types of media. The gallery was also redesigned to visually connect to the street, and a new digital gallery was added as part of this project. So Schomburg has always been an active place full of researchers and events, but now it also activates the street and engages the local community passing by. And this last project, Shannon writes about grafting as a form of stewardship. And I think we could consider our project for the Greenpoint Library and Environmental Education Center, a branch of the Brooklyn Public Library, as a graft onto the site, tapping into that urban rootstock and working with the history and the community to address past harms. The timeline of this project begins long before we became involved with it. There was not only a 1906 Carnegie Library on the site, but also a 1973 Lindsay box prior to our building. The environmental history of this area is alarming, with the toxic leaks from industry along Newtown Creek and the massive Greenpoint oil spill discovered in '78. Community activism around environmental concerns continues today, and it was a community's decision to use $5 million of their settlement from ExxonMobil, which is managed through GSEF, the Greenpoint Environmental Education or Environmental Fund, that helped shape this project. We worked closely with Brooklyn Library, with community members and library staff, and with a very active community advisory committee. It was a collective vision to design and create a library and education center to inspire the next generation of environmental justice activists. And as an example, this is an example, I'd say, of designing for rather than designing out. The community event space, the teen spaces include equipment like sinks and refrigerators and work counters, allowing for messy, wet experiments, embracing both, I guess, the wet and the dry work that could happen here. It's a building that's not only designed to demonstrate sustainable principles, but also to make sure that this would motivate everyone, especially youth, to become activists. The Brooklyn Library really exceeded our most ambitious vision and has hired an environmental justice coordinator who is amplifying the environmental programming and building a really vibrant sense of community here. As the library's finally opened, they've been pickling up on the rooftops, sewing, growing plants. They've giving away their produce on library carts outside. They're using the roofs for story time, for stargazing, for book talks, and for spotting the critters and the pollinators we were also designing for. Our collaborator for the landscape on this project and for actually all 3 libraries I presented is Scape. And while these images here focus on the outside, the educational moments are about the environment are sprinkled throughout the interior of the building as well. And I'll just end by saying that the library has been able to fully open to patrons now, and we feel like the graft is flourishing. Thank you. And I guess I've been passing it to Shawn.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, and thank you to the Urban Design Forum and the Architectural League for the invitation and organizing such a esteemed panel of speakers and presenters. So with that, I also want to acknowledge Shannon's book. It's been really a joy reading it and more than informative. So I'm going to share my screen right now and begin the presentation. Okay, so I thought what I would discuss a bit here has to do with historical knowledge and data, and using the two to craft a new narrative around perhaps community participation and community knowledge in general. So along with today's theme of centering public knowledge, one of the roles that I have as the director of the J. Max Bond Center at the City College of New York, Spitzer School of Architecture, is to interface with communities and what we call, and you've probably heard this before, democratize data in a way that it becomes useful and informative as it becomes more plentiful. And in that role, we've been working with communities, community boards in particular, and community organizations to basically inform and also help construct new narratives which allow them to understand data in a new way, but also to perhaps craft a new public imagination of how that information can translate into meaningful action. So what I'll begin with here is just a kind of a snapshot of some of the research that the center has been doing. Looking back at maps that I think you're all familiar with, Homeowners Loan Corporation, maps outlining redlining. And these maps used by the FHA not only tell the historical story of racist policies and injustices, but also explain development patterns through to today, and even forecast their persistence in current policies that's certainly remain in place as we see the city develop around them. In 2014, writer Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an essay for The Atlantic The Case for Reparations, in which he dissects the housing policy and lending practices of the FHA and calls for reparations around that. Although he doesn't give specific examples, in some ways this prompted some of our research on how we could work with a specific community, go back through years and years of data to kind of understand the kind of ripple effect that this initial policy had. So the historical data formed the basis of our own inquiry along with community partners into the very opaque processes of New York State real estate with a special focus on affordable housing and development, which through our own documentation and research underperforms in terms of its market share or lack thereof. And so amongst those categories that it's underperforming, we wanted to understand and document the key factors in social justice and equity that a kind of a reparative development concept might be able to address. I'll go on to the next slide. So some of our research just simply starts with outlining the historical conditions. So amidst the changing housing policies, for this audience in particular, we know that local laws were assembled and we produced this index that shows the rather slow evolving housing typologies and simply pose the question of what is next if we consider affordability as a principal mandate in this, to see if there's an identification of a typology that somehow addresses this. And our answer here was no. But in regards to the latest developments, to the left of this slide where we're seeing what's next is an indication of the super tall that I think many of us are very familiar with now, are becoming more familiar with. And the logic of posing this question of what's next was derived from the fact that in our estimation, the super tall is arguably a fairly innovative typology, but it's more or less a financial construct as opposed to an architecturally designed one. So we continue our inquiry by looking at data and sharing this data with our partners. Some of this we develop on our own, and others we're collecting through the enormous amounts of resources that are out there. So we are both producer and consumers of this data, and then attempt to translate or curate, you might say, to disseminate that to our partners and communities so that they can better understand how it affects or impacts them. So in continuing this questioning, or this line of questioning, with just the basic category of types of projects, here on the left, it was the number of housing starts or starts of construction, filing, et cetera. And you can see over the years, particularly from the 1920s forward, the amount of public versus not-for-profit and private was relatively low and actually diminished as we move ahead in time to the year 2020. And then on the right of that, you couple that with the percentage of change in housing prices, Manhattan showing a 185% change between the years 1996 and 2006. These are the kind of data points that we wanted to illustrate with respect to the question around affordable housing. And we felt like this was an imperative as housing price appreciation continues on a rapid upward trend, to somehow communicate that some action or some envisioning relative to this data might be required or necessary to achieve more equitable results. Again, part of what we do is linking data and beginning to tell a narrative that is useful for uncovering or making the connections, and I'll be quite careful here for the data scientists, but in some instances, correlations as well of how these things impact one another. So if you overlay redlining to this day, you'll see that there are consistent patterns that are revealed for communities that have large populations of unbanked residents. And also in many instances, it correlates to or corresponds to fewer amounts of branch banks or credit unions in those same neighborhoods. And this addresses the question of wealth accumulation as it relates to real estate. Patterns have shown, as well as recent reports, that the two are intertwined quite readily. So the little red rectangle here is referencing Central and West Harlem, which is two of the key areas that we conducted some of our research on. And many of you should be familiar, if not, with fairly recent reporting on Black home ownership being the lowest that it's been since the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And if we relate this back to the two previous slides, again, we're seeing that there is an impact that is being felt across particular communities that were affected by redlining initially, but it continues to this day. And the issue of wealth accumulation as it relates to real estate patterns and the unbanked and its relationship to the current and historic policies shows up here in all three of these kind of graphics, if you will. The links between wealth and home ownership in this country are pretty well understood, and thus tracing areas of the city back to redlining, specifically West and Central Harlem, allows us to illustrate the long-lasting impact of that redlining. This coupled with tracking the origins of investments, which is shown in this slide, when asking the question, where does development funds come from? And the resultant profits of those finished products being in communities where that capital and those profits are extracted back out of the community. So just through public records, we were able to identify headquarters that were typically throughout the city, investing in projects in Harlem, and then taking that capital or those returns on investments back outside of the community. So the unbanked and the falling home ownership once again correspond to trends that are shown here, illustrating the persistence of some of these problems. And again, using the data to help illustrate this and perhaps uncover opportunities to critique and understand that. So what do we do with this? When we tell the story, we are engaging communities to react, quite honestly, and to imagine alternatives. And in this instance, the financial and spatial are so uniquely intertwined. Things like capital stacks, complex financing structures are just as relevant, if not more in some cases, creating new mechanisms, financial and otherwise, that can operate within, but also on the periphery of more established systems. So what you're looking at here is a concept that the researchers at the Bond Center, students and faculty devised, where the concept of a bit lot, a portion of a lot related to available FAR, which I'll explain in a minute, is kind of introduced where people have rights to this portion of a real estate holding, if you will, and can invest in it without necessarily being banked. So we are leveraging some the potential of blockchain and other forms of currency, of crypto and others. And having that discussion to see if this is something that could be a future reparative possibility. And I'll begin to wrap things up here, where what I'll show here is that the air lot and bit lot are actually connected. So if we run from the very first slide to this very last slide, understanding the relationships between real estate policies, the financial constructs that allow those policies to persist and keep the inequity at its current position. If we challenge those precepts and concepts, what can we arrive at? So the bit lot is paired with unused FAR that exists in the form of air rights throughout Harlem. We've investigated this through open data, located where that FAR is. And this FAR is typically such small amounts where it's not financially feasible to add one story to a building. So if we aggregate them, if we can move these along with revising the city's policies in regards to doing this, could we managed to create a scenario by which affordable housing has a pathway as well as a financial structure that would enable communities to invest in this possibility through the BIT lot, and then also make a difference in terms of home ownership and the control over one's community through understanding these kind of disparate forms of information that often come to us in data. So I'll stop there, and I'm really excited to maybe extend this conversation and build off of the ideas both that were earlier presented and in chat. Thank you.
Terrific. Great. I'd love to invite everyone back on screen with us. Shannon, Farzana, Dan, Karen, Shawn. By the way, Josh, is my internet wonky? I got a bubble screen saying that I was breaking up.
You seem to be, you sound just fine.
Okay, great. Okay, just double checking. Super. Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts and work. I really appreciate, again, that kind of breadth of expertise and perspectives in this group. It's really exciting to have you all join this discussion. So as a reminder for everyone and all our attendees, feel free to plug in questions in the chat in the Q&A box, and we'll try to kind of weave it into our discussion now in the final half hour. So a few kind of questions come to mind throughout the discussion already. Josh and I are going to throw in a couple of questions, but we really want this to be a conversation amongst the group. But maybe I can kind of throw in a first question to break the ice around memory. One really important topic that Shannon addresses in the book is the role of cross-generational knowledge as a form of urban intelligence. So I'm wondering, how should those who govern and manage a city kind of consider memory and history when planning or designing neighborhoods? Kind of immediately comes to mind a lot of Farzana's work, kind of community design perspective, as well as kind of Shawn's maps on redlining. But I'll open that up to the rest of the group. Maybe Shannon, if you like, kind of kick it off, and if you want to reference some of the topics that you were kind of exploring on that topic of cross-generational knowledge.
Sure, I could just mention a few things, but honestly, I'd love to hear the more kind of practical applications that are demonstrated through each of the case studies and models that our 4 other panelists represented. But yeah, I do talk a little bit about, again, going back to the library as a great space of intergenerational knowledge, particularly for TAP in the maintenance chapter, acknowledging that, yes, there are a lot of interesting things that new technology, automation can add to the maintenance and repair kind of space, but that there's a lot of embodied long-term knowledge that kind of engage in care, the kind of care industries and maintenance fields that really lives in the bodies and kind of in the muscle memory of the people performing that knowledge. So that's often something, that's the type of knowledge that is often relayed through apprenticeships, for instance. So realizing that there is so much knowledge that is invested in people's bodies that comes through oral histories, through generations talking to one another. These are the types of things that are really hard to datify, and recognizing, yes, data, as all of these projects demonstrated, data can really help to direct our attention to particular places, can help us to identify historical patterns that could be useful in thinking about addressing contemporary problems. But there are a lot of other forms of intelligence, including these intergenerational kind of practiced ways that really have to supplement those data-driven things to make more inclusive and effective solutions and designs. So I'd love to hear the rest of you talk about these issues in relation to the case studies that you shared. Kitchens, I'm just thinking of kitchens, Tan. That's definitely a place of like historically intergenerational sharing of knowledge and a lot of kind of embodied ways of learning and doing things.
So Shannon, maybe I'll kick it off. Yeah, I mean, I think there's some incredible breadth in the book that talks about a number of things related to this topic, right? So, what came to mind was, when I was looking at Karen's work, the library as a repository for published work as a general idea, right? But then to turn that over on its head and actually start to collect personal narratives and personal histories and personal objects and those kinds of things. I think, similar to what I try to embody in my work, and it's hard to find ways to archive the sort of, messages that people have, right? So in community meetings and workshops and things like that, they kind of live and then they die, unfortunately, right? They kind of find a home in reports or other kinds of maybe almost less legitimized reports in some ways, right? Not the ones that come from the city and aren't publicly archived somewhere. And so you end up losing a lot of information that is done by good people in the city with good citizens. And what's interesting to me, and perhaps a call, is to have a better archive of work that we do on the urban planning side in New York. Because it's with every administration change, you lose all of the data and all of the conversations that you have with communities, and communities often suffer from too much engagement. In other words, repeated engagement, asking them the same questions a few years later with nothing having been done, right? And so I think that that's important as ways to think about this.
Yeah, Shannon, I mean, thanks for framing the question, and Farzana, I really appreciate your answer as well, because in the work that we do and speaking directly with communities, this issue of memory, we validate that as relevant data. And if I use the 1968 Fair Housing Act, there are many people who can describe to you the elation of what that opportunity presented to them. You couple that with today's reporting on Black home ownership being the lowest it's been since the late 60s, since that Fair Housing Act. And then you hear the kind of astonishment or a disconnect of how could such a thing happen. And if you start to look at policies in real estate, well, there's your answer, right? And so somehow the way that you enter into these conversations is through memory. It's through the articulation of whether it be the elation or more currently the trauma of losing one's property or not being able to afford it. And I think this gives immediate cause to action for policymakers, which is not necessarily a hard data point, but those conversations, those articulations of what's happening on the ground are extraordinarily powerful and have parallels to history, right? What was it that caused the Fair Housing Act to come into being? There's a different form of that activity that is allowing the loss of home ownership to people of color to persist. And so, again, somehow relying on the memory of where we were allows us to dissect the data through those conversations to kind of uncover where those commonalities and where those parallels really lie. And that's quite helpful in, I think, approaching elected officials and policymakers on how and why this is an imperative and why we need to be extremely creative and mindful of those stories.
I'm curious to hear from Dan and Karen, especially as designers. I mean, we're all designers in this group, but how can designers kind of help support in whether that be kind of through knowledge infrastructures like libraries to better recognize that memory is important data in that process?
I'll jump in. I mean, I was thinking as Farzana spoke about libraries that, Greenpoint was already and is and currently and still is a repository for environmental reports and data about that community. They also, as this project began, or maybe just before this project began, they were starting an oral history project, capturing the community's understanding and history around the environmental issues. And it has, the kind of memory and the impact of that, of the oil spill and toxicity of that neighborhood is obviously in their bodies and in their history and is lived. So that had brought a strength to the project. But as Farzana said, there's information and there's material, but the library is a great kind of holder of that, but primarily because there's people who work at the library, the librarians, and now an environmental justice coordinator who are bringing and shaping and helping people learn that material and use that material. So it's not just that the data is collected or stored or that the memories are there, but that there are people, there are librarians, and there's a a kind of a whole constellation committed to bringing this forward. And the environmental justice coordinator is not only, kind of a point of access toward that information, but is reshaping and continuing to build new traditions even within that community now, and bringing local community experts to the library to lead workshops and lead activities and events. So I think it's layered on the history that was there, but also the activities that are ongoing now. And so that memory gets built in as not just collections and archives, but as actions and activities. And I think that's what gives it a kind of strength.
I have a quick question for Karen. Do you find that the library is a sufficient sort of unbiased curator of the collection and sort of the repository of information? Because I think Shannon in her book touches a lot on sort of the capital biases, the political biases, the missing voices that come on dashboards and data collection in terms of what actually surfaces, right, and gets documented. And so is the library a sufficient enough unbiased entity, or do we need a new entity? I don't have an answer for this, but it's just a question.
Well, my biased answer would be that the libraries are pretty incredible about this, and partly because I see each of these branches each of the libraries I presented, but when you start to dive into this library system, every branch is responding very specifically and uniquely to their community. They're very responsive to what their community is looking for, and supporting the kind of creating support programs that support their needs. They're also, I'd say, really good at building that body of trust. And so I find that it's a pretty good place to start. I mean, I don't know I can definitively answer that, but I think it's a pretty amazing place to start.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer, Karen. And also I was thinking about the pickling you were talking about on the roof. And it feels like, in terms of the memory, the groups of people who operate and maintain the space and the community are part of, are necessary for non-textual knowledges, what Michael Polanyi calls tacit knowledges, to be passed down, cultural knowledges of practice rather than knowledges that are denotative, and that seems to be crucial, and historically how many forms of memory, in the kitchen or whatnot, are passed down. So maybe my answer to thinking, Guillermo, your question of designers is, it feels to me that libraries are an amalgam of spaces and the people who maintain and operate it. They're necessarily hybrid kind of forms and have to, you couldn't have a library without any librarians. And so then the question is what is the same way that the space has a logic of how it's operated, what is the organizational logic of how it's operated? And does the space, to me, I would say, in order for longevity to happen and this kind of generational knowledge to pass down, the organization, I'm a big fan of cooperatives, a cooperative organization that can allow both the people to change and also the space that allows it to be changed by the cooperative feels like a necessary component for long-term longevity to happen. We have these things already in extended family forms. We don't call them cooperatives, but generationally, as people grow older and power shifts and moves along. And so it seems to me that the organizational structure of how power moves and then also how the space supports that are the kind of necessary conditions to support an organization like a library to have a long-term generational knowledge. But if that organizational structure is locked to a certain kind of institutional structure, then who works there, or how people can decide who works there, or how people can decide what kind of things or bias the community, the organization wants or doesn't want, itself is locked to a kind of organizational structure, and thus the memory, how memory can be passed down would be locked according to the organizational structure of how the group works, if that makes sense. And so that's a non-spatial answer, but I feel like that's true in my experience.
I just want to bring in something that Rebecca Coleman, a librarian, mentioned in the chat that repeats what I would have said also, that no librarians would say they're definitely they're not an unbiased profession. They're biased towards justice and inclusion in many cases. And then there's often also on the opposite side, a long history of kind of white supremacy and racial discrimination and colonialism in library classification systems and in the institution itself and its history. That said, if you look at polls by the Pew Foundation, et cetera, you find that public libraries are still one of the most trusted, I'm not not quite sure how they operationalize that or ask those questions. One of the most trusted public institutions, which is something to be said there. But also many libraries, including I think Brooklyn, is especially good at this, of partnering with community organizations, particularly kind of social justice oriented, who maybe can use the local branch library, a relatively easy to access space to gather a group to kind of engage their own programming. One final example I'll give is that I haven't run into too many libraries who do this here, but I was looking through some libraries in Ireland the last time I was there and found that there's a whole section where they essentially display and make public planning data and documents to help people to inform themselves. All the work that Shawn is doing, all the interesting data that Karen has collected through their similar kind of library data project, that would have been printed out, turned into a book, filed away in the public library so that folks can then use that and reference it at any time they want to inform themselves, to be kind of engaged in planning discussions and kind of town hall meetings, et cetera, related to things that affect their communities. So there's a way maybe we could do more of kind of actually incorporating some of the data that folks like Shawn and Karen are generating and using a library as a relatively accessible repository for that material.
We actually have a question from the Q&A that I think builds out this discussion really nicely. This is from Charles Chewalka. It's a quick comment and question. The idea of harnessing libraries as bastions of shared information is spot on. It seems like it can be a modern day analog to previously how houses of worship or sacred space were spaces of cross-generational, cross-class communication. How do we begin to reinvigorate a sense of shared values and histories within communities via these spaces? And are there other spaces, such as aside from libraries, that can provide similar effects or accomplish these goals?
I would say that community spaces, third spaces, cooperatively run spaces, do that quite often. You know, again, I'll harp on cooperatives again, but where the people in the space have the agency to shape the space together, and there's a lot of self-governance that's possible. And I think this is the kind of thing that's unfortunately quite hard in New York City to be place-based because of the cost of real estate and rent, and as such is way more popular elsewhere. A lot of, which is why, you know, things like the Real Estate Investment Cooperative, which I am part of, which aims to kind of pool collective money to create a community land trust in New York. Like these efforts like this that have been possible in many other areas, including say Minneapolis, are a lot more difficult in New York. But I would say, yeah, the kind of organizational structure of cooperatives or community land trusts are kind of like the real estate underpinnings and then the organizational underpinnings that can make these kind of third spaces happen.
I would also argue, you know, in some of the sort of placemaking projects that I showed at the end there, you know, in Puerto Rico and in Africa and places, they're not New York, right? But I think that they, you know, having been built with the community, they become, there's a sense of ownership. They become sort of landmarks in public space that become the new place for public forum, right? There's reliable infrastructure, there's a place to gather, you know, there's an idea that help can arrive at a certain space. You know, I'm talking specifically about the storm stations that we built in Puerto Rico. They become relief aid, you know, sort of drop-off points. And people come together not only during times of disaster, but we found to create performances, to become activists within their own society. They start sharing knowledge with each other, right? And the fact that they're all networked across multiple locations, you know, that there's an archive of that activity that starts to, you know, proliferate across the spaces. So I think that there's some power also in public space.
Yeah, I was thinking with respect to the library and kind of services that it provides, not just spatially, but just in terms of an archive of knowledge and information. But it's similarly operated, and again, I'm going to focus on, you know, in this case, communities in Harlem that I'm very familiar with, but the loss of churches, right? So there's this idea that the library could also be a non-denominational place of worship, which again, lots of information is exchanged and passed down through those sort of religious activities. in gatherings, which include everything from dance to food, as well as worship. And so, I think I've only come to sort of imagine this possibility as, again, community partners lamenting the loss of a fairly familiar to us typology that we're seeing disappear throughout the city, and particularly in certain communities where what was formerly churches have now become condominiums with the requisite bank or drugstore at its base. And so those sorts of spaces, I think, challenge us as designers to kind of reimagine future programming, and maybe advocate for the importance of those types of spaces to reappear in a different form, albeit, but certainly try to reclaim their significance and what they offer to communities by and large.
I'll just also add, given that Shawn is the director of the Max Bond Center, I think some of Max Bond's history provides some interesting examples of how to build collective physical and kind of community spaces. And I also have a plug to my friend and colleague, Brian Goldstein's work, who's writing a book about Max Bond, and I think is actually giving a talk somewhere in the city this week. I'm not exactly sure.
Next week.
Next week.
Yes,
Okay.
the J. Max Bond lecture at AIA New York, the Bond Center, and Noma Nikola. Yes.
That's great.
October 14th.
Thank you. And then I also just point out an article I put in the chat by Anna Puigjoner. I hope I'm saying the last name correctly, about the use of urban kitchens in Peru in particular, this feminist space of intergenerational knowledge sharing. So that's just a nice way to connect our discussion here to especially the kitchen as a metaphor, and not only a metaphor, but a literal model for kind of the building of intelligence too.
I was just going to ask you, Shawn, if the BitLot concept is a way to begin to come back to this question, like how could a community decide to invest in something else? It doesn't have to be a library at that point, but could decide to invest in something, whether it's a kitchen or some other place. Right.
Well, I certainly glossed over a number of particulars with respect to that, but that is precisely the intention, that the concept of a portion of a lot, however small, could be created as a value proposition and secondarily a financial construct. When we're talking about wealth, it is unquestionable in our country, in America, the connection between wealth accumulation and property, no matter how large or small. And if one thinks about the immense value that property has here in New York City, well, just a small portion of that could be instrumental in changing a family's fortunes, or at least beginning to construct the notion of a future of how to establish that kind of possibility. And as I mentioned, right now the concept is just that, it's a concept, but we studied financial markets as well to kind of understand what the future potential is. Translating this information back to communities starts with just acknowledging and without shame, asking how many people are unbanked, how many people are outside of the traditional financial markets, just in terms of saving accounts and living day by day or on public assistance, but yet they are legacy residents of a place that's been redlined. So, again, making those connections and beginning to probe through partnerships, I would say. I think the other important thing here that's clearly illustrated in Shannon's book is just the diversity of industries that are racing ahead to try to amass some comprehension of what it means to have all this data to do with it. And I think simultaneously, it's imperative for some of us to help also, in terms of this literacy, translate this information back to communities so they can come along with the kind of exhausting speed that industry moves with, but at least have a sense that where do I fit in here and what is my possible future? And even if it amounts to a kind of real estate or housing question, because that the need of affordable housing is unquestionable and well documented. And so the means of how we get there, community by community, I think is a really powerful question. Something we're excited about continuing to work on.
I think that edge. Oh, sorry.
No, feel free, Karen. Sorry.
I was so fascinated with Farzana's example of the school and the facade and that, and just like it. And so I was thinking relative to Shawn's, bit lots that, it doesn't take much space necessarily to kind of create that, those moments where you could be supporting a space for public knowledge. And that could be as simple as that project and bringing that forward.
So I know we're almost out of time, but I gotta squeeze in a question for maintenance. One last question, kind of the term care is, I think, really having a moment. Again, perhaps we're seeing kind of federal proposals for supporting the care economy. At the city level, we have folks like actually friends of ours, Justin Garrett Moore, proposing a Department of Care and city government at the city level to build out kind of community capacity for maintenance in the public realm. So how critical is care and maintenance in both the physical and social connections in cities and neighborhoods, as well as digital infrastructures? I know we have a couple minutes left. Obviously, it's a huge topic, but just kind of open it up for any kind of last thoughts on that.
I'll just say that I think it's vitally important. Yes, care is having a moment, and there's also kind of a critique of care, saying that we've fetishized care in some cases, that care is often used as a way to responsibilize individual people for filling in where social infrastructures fail. Self-care can readily be commercialized. So we have to be cautious and critical about the way we think about and kind of promote and practice care. That said, I think it's a really integrally important thing to think about across the scales of cities' operations and infrastructures. So not only do we have to care for kind of bridges and buildings and affordable housing and public transit, all the failed things that haven't been cared for, that the pandemic in particular kind of rendered very visible, but reminding us that the digital infrastructures that allow those things to operate also require care. This is something that, a lot of and smart city models don't often think about, is, how about the long-term maintenance, the fact that there are data cleaners on the back end who have to clean the data to make kind of systems operable. So thinking about how care for individual bodies performing the labor, care for the databases, for the physical infrastructure, all the way scaled up to kind of mega scale urban systems. All of these things require attention, whether it's maintenance, repair, or care, which are kind of often used as somewhat interchangeable terms.
Yeah, I think this is interesting because by definition, I feel like a lot of work that's care and maintenance involved is very difficult to share. And if it's the kind of work you can share it, I feel like they're often contrary to each other. I feel I do a lot of care work and maintenance work and, stewarding spaces and taking care, and it almost feels very strange to talk about it because oftentimes it is interpersonal or relational or social or communal. And so maybe a question that I'll put back out there is like, if care is so important, yet the things we often share are more documented or more like work oriented, like how do we reckon with like the care work that is involved and resist it translating into work, oh, here's what I did. I cooked for my friend the other day, or, I stewarded, did certain facilitated something, how is there not like a tension inherently behind like wanting to support care and also wanting to, in spatial practice, it also knowing that that's just, it's very difficult to document or share, or we lose something in the process. There seems to be like an inherent tension there. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but I feel like when it comes to space, to me, the care has often been very interpersonal and social. And so our roles like designer or architect even helpful, or planner helpful in thinking about care work? Is that a contradiction that we can resolve? Maybe that's what I'm sitting with, and not wanting to document the care work that I might be doing.
If there are no other comments, we do hate to cut such a fascinating conversation short, but as you all know, we are at time. So I think we should all give a digital round of applause to Shannon, Farzana, Dan, Karen, and Shawn for joining us today. Make sure to go out and buy Shannon's new book, City is Not a Computer. We're actually plugging in a discount code in the chat, and continue following the incredible work of all four of our respondents. So just a couple of last notes. To learn more about the Architectural League programs and projects, you can visit archleague.org. And please visit Urban Omnibus at urbanomnibus.net to check out our latest features and to explore our decade-plus trove of material. That includes the 2019 special series Digital Frictions, which was actually guest edited by Shannon, featured a contribution from Dan. And you can also keep up with the Architectural League and Urban Omnibus by subscribing to our newsletters.
And at the forum, I want to thank our fellows, board of directors, and directors circle for their support. Go visit our website, urbandesignforum.org, and learn more about our current initiatives. And I hope you can join us at some upcoming events we're leading this month on the future of New York City streets under the next administration as part of our Streets Ahead series. And of course, stay in touch. In the coming months and weeks, the forum, the League, and Omnibus will announce a new partnership in honor of and memory of our shared and beloved friend, Michael Sorkin. So thanks to all our speakers. And I want to thank you, Josh, friend and co-pilot with fabulous co-moderation. Have a nice week, everyone. Thanks.